This is the part of lecture I planned on finishing in the first few minutes of lab for October 30th. So here is a recording of it. This is the remaining few slides on ectothermy. We left off talking about animals in the desert that are ectotherms. And one of the ones that at first makes no sense at all are your desert amphibians. This shouldn't make sense because one of the defining characteristics of amphibians is the fact that they have permeable skin, that their skin allows them to do cutaneous respiration, and because it's a respiratory surface, it must in fact remain moist. Well, in a desert, the number one defining feature is the lack of moisture. So how can something that requires moist skin survive in the desert? Well, the truth is that the only way that they do this is by being out when the conditions are right. Your desert anorans are your desert frogs, and they may, in fact, spend buried for 9 to 10 months out of the year without access to liquid water because of their permeable skin. So they may only be able to be active in this environment for 2 to 3 months out of the year. And that permeable skin is their drawback, but they are able to survive in the desert. And for these organisms that are able to survive in ecosystems like this, it means that they're able to live and they don't otherwise go extinct when they might be outcompeted from other environments and therefore have to go extinct. Were they not able to adapt to live here? The spadefoot toad has that keratinized foot structure that allows it to build its burrows. And these burrows act as sheltered habitats where they can hide from the solar radiation that would otherwise dry them out and the wind movement that would otherwise dry them out. Those of you that have not lived in areas that are very windy or haven't spent extensive time outside in the wind in the winter, wind can dry out your skin very quickly. The spadefoot toad's burrow is rather cool and wetter than the other areas in the desert. And the burrows, because of the depth they are, the way that they are oriented away from solar radiation and away from wind, can perhaps even stay moist. And if the burrows are moist, then the toad can utilize that moisture from the soil to keep their skin moist. As the toad gets drier and the conditions become drier, they actually increase the amount of urea they keep in their body, increasing their amount of nitrogen waste storage in order to keep the water they have from evaporating. So they are utilizing nitrogen as a way of keeping water. For tree frogs that are found in drier areas, and for many of our tree frogs who aren't living necessarily in contact with wet environments, we find that they lose water through their skin at 10% the rate of other types of frogs. And they also use that retaining of urea as a way of dealing with water regulation. This urea retention might sound like something you've heard of before. It was also used by sharks. So this seems to be something that will reemerge a few different times in different lineages for different reasons. See if we can get to the next slide. That brings us to our desert fishes, who seem even perhaps worse off than our desert amphibians. For our desert amphibians, they can still use their temporary pools for breeding sites. The tadpoles can then move between the shallow and the deep portions of these temporary pools, depending upon time of day and solar radiation levels. We find that our tadpoles tend to, for desert amphibians, develop rather quickly. And this rapid development of the tadpoles allows these creatures to live and breed in the deserts. And the movement between shallow and deep waters allows the tadpoles to adjust the temperatures that they're exposed to. They go into the deeper shallows during the daytime in order to cool down, and these shallow areas in the nighttime in order to stay warmer at night. So they're able to then moderate the temperature they're exposed to by changing the depth of water they're in. But fish, as I was just saying, it's a little bit harder to be a fish in the desert. You need water at all times, liquid water to actually live in. So fish do require permanent water. You can find permanent water in desert areas, but like the terrestrial portions of the desert, it faces the same temperature regime problems, but water changes more slowly than air temperature does in the desert. The fish, like the tadpoles, regulate their body temperature by moving their location within the temporary pond. But what does it mean to be a fish in the desert? Well, we find that there are fish throughout deserts. There are pupfish, there are minnows, there are the cichlids, there's dace, and you might remember the pupfish species we talked about that can withstand very high temperatures here, living in deserts, desert hole pupfish. There are very few ponds or bodies of water in deserts that contain more than 5 species of fish. Most of them will have a single species of fish, or maybe even 2. The water temperature will depend on whether or not it is, well, generally it's going to be spring fed of some way, the temperature of the spring and the temperature of the air temperature. And the fish are going to have to adapt to changes in air temperature. The ponds and the lakes, though, will have seasonal temperature and salt changes. Some of the ponds that are found in the deserts are the remnants of larger lakes, and they may have saltier water due to the development of desert. When they warm, they also tend to shrink. So as different seasons happen and you go through droughts and lots of rainfall, lots of little rainfall really in the desert, you may find that the ponds contract and expand. And as they do, the fish are allowed to spread out or they have to move into more concentrated areas, which is going to then increase the competition for food and make it harder for all of them to perhaps survive. The changes in temperature, salt, and oxygen, dissolved oxygen being linked to the temperature of the water here, are going to make it difficult to live here. The desert hole pupfish do cope well, and they can even be living in 40 to 41 degree Celsius temperature water, even when there's 30 degrees Celsius temperature water at another end of a pool. They seem to be able to handle it well. Their bodies are well adapted to living here. Stream flow will vary throughout the year. Dry seasons are going to give you small intermittent pools. Wet seasons may result in floods where the fish are actually carried out of the correct environment. But in order to make it through the dry seasons, we find that long-fin dace can survive on wet algal mats, and they can swim in only a few centimeters of water depth. And they can handle that, especially at nighttime, without risk of drying out. We also find, because of this boom and bust cycle of rain in the desert, that populations of fish will explode, grow rapidly during rainy seasons and good years in order as a way of rebounding through bad year times. And it's hard to be an ectotherm in warm deserts. It's also really hard to be one in cold deserts. In a cold desert, you're not only dealing with not a lot of water. In the hot desert, you dealt with the evaporating of not a lot of water. Now you're dealing with the freezing of not a lot of water. Your temperatures are frequently dropping below freezing. This may happen on a seasonal basis, but if you live at the high altitudes, it can happen on almost a daily basis. Keep in mind your ectotherms cannot produce heat and they lack insulation. They avoid freezing though by supercooling or synthesizing their own antifreeze compounds. We'll look a little bit more at this on the next slide. And some of them will actually be able to tolerate both freezing and thawing. Looking at the frog at the top right of the screen, so not Kermit, but your other frog, he does appear to be frozen. He's covered in ice crystals. He's not dead, though. We've discovered that some of our amphibians have mechanisms that allow their bodies to freeze and thaw without having cellular and tissue damage. This is not something we can do. When this happens to us, we have frostbite, we die. But amphibians can handle this well. Fish that live in very, very cold waters may not be in a desert, but they still may be very much in cold temperatures. They're able to handle this through either supercooling or the synthesizing of antifreeze. Your fish that supercool are able to have water in their bodies in a liquid state below the freezing point of water. They do this because their body tissues lack the nucleating agent to start freezing. So freezing can only happen if there's something to freeze upon. If the fish that can supercool their bodies, however, touch ice crystals, their bodies will start to freeze. So they're only capable of supercooling water as long as they're moving in really cold water. For synthesizing antifreeze, this seems to have happened in a variety of different ways. Generally speaking, the fish create glycoproteins or polypeptides and small proteins that allow them to lower the freezing point of their body fluids to a point that's below the water that they're swimming in. So they are effectively preventing water from forming ice crystals by lowering the freezing point of water. Think about this as adding salt to the road as lowering the freezing point of water. Some of them evolved glycerol, and the concentration of glycerol, they will increase as winter progresses. This allows them to lower the freezing point of water to about 17 degrees below zero. There is an Antarctic ice species, Trematois venturi, the emerald rock cod, which you see a picture of here, that has a glycoprotein that is 200 to 500 times more effective at lowering the freezing temperature as is salt at the same concentration. It's pretty remarkable that these fish have the ability to create their own antifreeze. Lizards and turtles can handle freezing temperatures a little differently. The Aro's spiny lizard will allow its body to supercool on cool nights. And on really cold nights, it also finds spaces in warm rock crevices to hide. Painted turtles do things a little differently. They hatch in the fall, but they remain in their nest until the spring. The soil in their nests will generally freeze because their nests aren't that far beneath the ground surface. However, their outer layer of skin forms a barrier to the ice crystals. It forms an alpha keratin layer with lipids on the inner surface. This increases their survival in the cold. However, if they come into contact with the freezing water and the freezing soil, they too may freeze. So if they're in contact with the frozen ice crystals, they will start to freeze. But as long as they maintain themselves inside of their nest, they are fine. This is not found in other turtles. But this increases the chance of the painted turtle surviving in an area where it otherwise may not be able to. And it also means that their young can hatch in the fall as opposed to the spring to be ready to, when spring happens, emerge and start feeding, giving them a leg up on other turtles. So it will then give their young a longer time period to start developing throughout the year. And we have our frozen frogs, but not just frogs. Salamanders, toads, aquatic frogs, etc. can bury themselves deep in the soil. If you bury yourselves deep in soil, you might not be exposed to temperatures below freezing, or at least your body liquids might not be exposed to temperatures below freezing, so you survive. Others will hibernate. Where you're close to the soil surface, temperatures are below perhaps the freezing of the body. But when you go down a few inches, that may not be true. Some of our frogs and salamanders, amphibians, can handle freezing and thawing multiple times. For many of them, temperatures need to get below -10 degrees Celsius before they become lethal, because above that -10 degrees Celsius, the ice crystals form differently. They may form some inside of the cells that do not cause cellular damage. They need 65% on average of their body to freeze solid. They can survive up to 65% of the water in their body freezing solid. Above that 65%, they tend to die, but below that, they're pretty good. They may, like the fish, use glucose or glycerol to stop intracellular freezing. By increasing the concentration of these in their body, they can decrease the temperature at which they freeze. But some of your frogs literally become frozen, like the one in this picture here, where they're trapped in ice and ponds, or they're unable to retreat underground. These frozen frogs are motionless. Respiration stops. Heartbeat is slow or may actually become irregular or cease altogether. Blood isn't going to circulate in the frozen tissues. It can't. But somehow the cells themselves don't freeze. This is related to the lifestyle of ectotherms, but their metabolism is so low that they are able to withstand this freezing. Why? The ecological significance is a little unclear. This is a huge risk to go through. We assume that, and this seems true for most of them, the ones that are able to handle this freezing are all those that need to breed early in the year. It may allow them to have a faster emergence in the spring. And it may be more seen in males than females, because the males either need to set up a territory or otherwise arrive first at the breeding grounds. So they're going to risk the highest in order to be there. It may also happen predominantly in species who take a longer time to develop or metamorphosize, by having that longer time from the spring through to the next freeze. But your big risk is a very large cold snap could become deadly. So you're risking death against reproductive output. And it seems for the most part, the reproductive output tends to win. These ectotherms are going to play a pretty big role in terrestrial ecosystems. Vertebrates live by getting energy from their food. Ectotherms require less energy because they do not need to generate their own heat. They do less metabolism, and because of that, they need less food. Ectotherms survive on 10 to 14% the metabolic rate of birds and mammals of the same size. Ectothermy is not expensive. It requires an order of magnitude less food than endothermy does. Another way of thinking about that is endothermy requires at least 10 times the amount of food as ectothermy, which means it's really expensive to be a tiny endotherm. So because of that, ectotherms have been able to exploit niches that would have otherwise been unavailable to endotherms. Surface area to volume seems to play a ratio too. Smaller organisms change temperature faster, so ectothermy is better than endothermy if you're tiny. Elongate forms are also really bad to be an endotherm. An endothermic snake would have lots of problems because it's hard to keep an elongate body form with a lot of surface area to small volume warm. Lateral flattening is also bad for endotherms, but common in ectotherms. So what the life forms are that ectotherms have are very good for their lifestyle and also very bad for an endotherm lifestyle. So this divergence between ectotherm and endotherm is not just related to how much food they need and their metabolism differences. We also see that certain body forms are better for one or the other. And to kind of expand on that, a small body size and a specialized body form work well for those ectotherms. That means they spend less than 10% of their energy on metabolism, so they're able to go longer between meals. They're able to do more with the energy that they do have. Ectotherms are efficient at converting energy into body mass, much more efficient than endotherms. This allows them to easily then repackage food for larger predators. They're going to feed a lot more endotherms then. Ectotherms and endotherms, as we continue to go through this semester, you'll realize live in really different worlds. Their interactions with the physical world are very different. Their interactions with the biological world are also going to be very different. And the way they interface with non-vertebrates is also probably quite different. These are very different approaches to life on land. And while ectothermy is ancestral, it is no less effective than the more derived endothermy. They are just different ways of living. And I think I am pausing the recording.